With a mighty shout he rose, brighter than the sun and more fierce. In his hand he held a rod of twisted bone, crossed and double-crossed to form the sign of his dark lord, a symbol of his power and fruit of mortal longings well fulfilled. He rose above the company, taller far than they, and looked with black pride on these frightened slaves. He snarled, and heard the sound of noble hatred echoing from the skies. He stared the savage stare of immortal fury, and death was in his gaze. And on that blasted heath his ashen servants turned, gripped by cold, unthinking terror, and fled his presence. And on that blasted heath, a demon prince was born. Greetings friends and welcome to the old world. I'm Lorcan, and this is OnlyWar. The purpose of this video is to cover the old world lore and history of Be'lakor, the first demon prince, and then speculate a little on how he could be implemented as a bonus 10th legendary lord beyond the 9 we've been told about in Total War Warhammer 3. Be'lakor has a confusing history within fantasy lore, as he was more integral in the original Storm of Chaos Darkness Rising storyline, attempting to one-up Archaon while taking part in the Siege of Mordheim directly, with a reanimated Volkmar the Grim chained to his battle standard. The changes to the events of the Storm of Chaos, particularly the fate of Volkmar and the fall of Mordheim, are too integral to the newer versions of events to incorporate both in Be'lakor's tale, without some timeline bending and headcanon to rejoin the dots. For the sake of keeping things simple, we'll stick to his story as it is now, leading up to the crowning of Archaon, and the start of events that lead to the end times, and how these could lead to options for Be'lakor's implementation in Total War Warhammer 3. Maybe there'll be a campaign where we can decide which hideous fate to put Volkmar through. So thank you for joining me, and hark well as I tell you the tale of Be'lakor First Damned. May his forgotten true name be forever cursed. In his arrogance he drew the gaze of the Chaos God to this world, bringing damnation upon us all. An ancient evil of pure malevolence beyond imagining, the demon prince Be'lakor was the first of his kind. Raised up from immortality by the gods of chaos combined, he was granted a portion of each of their power. At first Be'lakor used the jealousy of the ruinous powers to gain their favours, never completely swearing his allegiance to any one of them. For a time the gods fought over Be'lakor as children might squabble over a favoured toy. However, they soon realised the folly of combining their might into a single vessel, as Be'lakor became less controllable, and his ambitions an ascension to rival their own power. Choosing only champions that would be loyal to them and them alone, each god soon began to raise up new demon princes, and while Be'lakor remained the strongest of them, his might was diminished as the gods spread their power amongst their other servants. This led to further conflict within the demonic hordes as these former mortals retained the very human trait for conquest, and their followers fought amongst themselves to secure territory to the detriment of striking the definitive blows that would have wiped out all of the final bastions of the mortal civilizations and plunged the world into never-ending anarchy. Drawn back into the realms of chaos with all the other demonic minions as magic was drained from the world by the Great Vortex, the dark gods bestowed upon their errant servant an eternal fate both cruel and fitting for one whose ambition to lead and conquer extended beyond his fealty. After centuries of madness and banishment, Be'lakor has now become a master of shadows, moving behind the veil of the Immaterium to twist the course of history in his attempts to free himself from his hated destiny, and exerting the will of the Chaos Gods whether he knows it or not. He is the first, the harbinger of doom. Where he treads, the shadows writhe, and the light flees in terror. Speak not his name. In the hazy mists of the far distant past, a great conflagration engulfed the world. The elder races of the dwarves, elves, and lizardmen cowered in fear as blossoming clouds of flame filled the heavens and fire rained down over the continents, marking the final departure of the ancient Old Ones. The earth shook with fury and the ground opened up with gaping maws swallowing entire lands and mountains, while cities and civilizations slipped beneath the raging waters as oceans heaved and boiled. Reality warped and contorted as the seething rift opened and the fabric of the world itself was torn apart. The dark moon Morslabe appeared in the sky, joining its brother Manslabe to mark the birth of chaos into the world. The arrival of chaos heralded the introduction of raw, uncontrolled magical energy, something far more random and dangerous than the refined power wielded by the Old Ones. The defenses devised by the Old Ones to protect against this form of attack were overwhelmed by the sheer volume of chaos energy that pulsed into the world. Though if these defenses had not been in place, the world may well have been torn apart by the sudden convergence of uncontrollable power. Formed of pure energy, demons poured into the world from their insubstantial realm, ready to gorge themselves on the mortals that fell before them in horror. The tremendous invasion of demonic entities swept all before them in a bloodthirsty and terrible war, rejoicing in physical form and sensation and bathing in the glorious slaughter of battle. Their invasion scattered armies before them, and all who faced the screaming demonic hordes were hacked down or fled. The dwarves retreated to their mountain strongholds, the start of their increasing self-isolation from the other races. As demons swept through Ulthuan, the innocent and sheltered elves despaired, seeing no hope in their dire situation. While the centers of civilizations of the ancient lizardmen, elves, and dwarves came under siege, and their armies were mostly forced from the field, the early descendants of man were still little more than nomadic, heavy-browed, and brutal creatures, not far removed from the orc and goblin tribes. In the times before the Great Catastrophe, the Old Ones had seen the great potential in the adaptable nature of the human race, and had chosen to teach the druids of Albion some of their magical secrets. But outside of these very select rituals, humanity was deemed too primitive for the high magic of the Slann and elves, or the runecraft of the dwarves. In the 4 centuries between the collapse of the polar gates and the creation of the Great Vortex by the High Elves, demonic hosts spread all over the globe, and while the stronger, more advanced civilizations of the elder races were the focus of the greatest hosts, the scattered tribes of humanity would have struggled to survive as smaller hunting parties slaughtered any resistance, as the stronger demons laid claim to territory and the souls of their subjugated populations. It is hypothesized by some that the collapse of the polar gates that formed the Chaos Moon Morslabe from Warpstone, the condensed and solidified essence of chaos, also rained the same fell substance as dust through the atmosphere of the planet, twisting many races into corrupted new species, tainted by pure chaos. But more controversial is the theory that this dust was the catalyst for the development of the human race, giving it the versatility and lust for change that led to the rise of all the greatest civilizations of humanity, but also making humans the richest source of willing servants of chaos. The world of the superstitious primitive humans must have been changed beyond all belief, as the warping magical energies flowed over the globe, making nightmares into reality. With demons hunting them down without mercy, the beasts and plants they recognized becoming twisted into new forms, and mutations and disfigurement likely commonplace within their own tribes, It would not be out of the realms of possibility for some of the more fierce and barbaric amongst them to cast aside their former deities and spirits, and recognize the obvious and very real power of chaos all around them. While some may have been forced into subservience and worship, others in the full sight and horror of chaos dedicated their immortal souls to these deities of unknowable power, hoping to gain their favour or avert their wrath. One such savage and bloodthirsty human would become the first mortal to gain immortality. He came to be known in legend and prophecy by a myriad of names: the Harbinger, the Forsaken, and the Bearer, to name but a few. Be'lakor, however, is the true name of this entity of darkness and despair. Be'lakor was the first mortal raised to the exalted rank of Demon Prince, though through what sacrifices he made and atrocities tainted his soul to do so are lost even to the oldest tales. This primitive human revelled in the chaos that had descended on his world. Such was the inventiveness and cruelty of his dark deeds against his fellow mortals, Be'lakor drew the Chaos God's gaze, intriguing all four of the Dark Brothers sufficiently that when he offered to dedicate his slaughters to their name and his eternal soul for immortality of demonhood, each granted him a portion of their godly might, and granted his wish. This soon proved a mistake. The Chaos Gods seldom share anything for long, and so it was with Be'lakor. As the first, and at that time only, Demon Prince, Be'lakor was an incomparable prize of immense conjoined power that could tip the scales of the great game if he could be persuaded to swear fealty to one of the Dark Brothers over the others. Thus did the Chaos Gods war for control of Be'lakor's tainted soul, each one determined to force his brothers to relinquish their claim, but each becoming more invested in turn. Each offered the devious Be'lakor ever greater power if he would simply consent to lead their armies to victory. Be'lakor knew the power he wielded in this position, so he tricked each of the Chaos Gods into granting their pre-offered gifts, and then fled to the mortal world without fulfilling his part of any bargains. Be'lakor arrived at a time rife with opportunity for one such as he. The great polar gates had collapsed, and magic coursed across the world. Be'lakor could wrestle many of the demons that followed in the magic's wake to his will, and forged an army to serve his own purpose, rather than those of the Chaos Gods. Thus did the Demon Prince conquer the primitive humans of the north, though many tribes came willingly, for they had already pledged themselves to the Dark Gods, and rightly saw their reflection in Be'lakor's dark majesty. A creature of living shadows, tangible only when he wished to be, a master of terror and illusion, who feasted on mortal fears. For many mortal generations of barbarians, Be'lakor revelled in his new station. He crushed the races whose names are now long forgotten, and brought war upon the nascent realms of the elves and the dwarves. Few could withstand Be'lakor, for the stuff of chaos blew strong across the world, and it was his weapon and sustenance both. Cities fell beneath his wrath, their names erased from history, and their peoples trampled into dust. With each victory, Be'lakor ordered monuments raised to his glory. Thus were the toppled stones of the cities hewn into new shapes, monoliths along the geomantic web that throbbed with the power of chaos. Winding stairs leading into the sky, the better for the Demon Prince to bask in the life-giving winds of magic, and wells sunk deep to sup on those chaotic energies. However, each conquest not only made Be'lakor more powerful, but edged him closer to his downfall. For even in rebellion he had unwittingly performed the Dark God's bidding. Be'lakor had done much to spread the creed of chaos across the mortal world. In time, the Demon Prince's own mortal followers drew the unblinking gaze of the Chaos Gods, and were raised too to princehood. This time the Dark Brothers made no effort to share their mortal prizes, nor was there any need, for there was no shortage of suitable champions. In a short space of time, Be'lakor became but one Demon Prince amongst many, and where he'd once ruled without challenge, he now found himself beset by dozens of would-be usurpers. Worse, with each new Demon Prince who ascended, Be'lakor felt his own powers ebb, as the gifts bestowed upon him were stripped away and granted to those more loyal. Battle now raged across the mortal lands Be'lakor had claimed, as the newborn demon princes sought to carve out their own territories. Yet none could achieve dominance, not even Be'lakor, for all his wit and guile. Countless thousands of humans perished in the wars of the demon princes, yet out of this great evil some good emerged. As so many demonic legions had been drawn into this conflict, the realm of Ulthuan was not as beset as it might have been, and this allowed the elves the opportunity to marshal one last desperate attempt to stem the tide of chaos, a great vortex that would siphon magic from the world. The elves' great success was the demon prince's downfall. As magic faded from the world, the demons were drawn back into the realm of chaos, Be'lakor the last to be banished, for his connection to the mortal plane was greater than any, but even he could not resist the vortex's pull. In the realm of chaos, the dark powers were displeased with their errant servant and his treacherous ambition. Tzeentch would bestow upon Be'lakor the cursed destiny to become the true essence of chaos. Cursing his name, he would exist in only a confused and maddened, hate-filled state, and denied physical form. For thousands of years, Be'lakor's essence drifted through the realm of chaos in hatred and madness. In brief moments of lucidity, he yearned to set foot upon the mortal world once more, and feigning repentance, beseeched the Chaos Gods to send him forth once again in their name. Yet the Dark Brothers remembered too well how Be'lakor had once deceived them, and had devised a suitable punishment. Thus, for the second time in his existence, Be'lakor succeeded in uniting the Dark Brothers in one common goal, but he found the second occasion much less to his liking. Unlike other demons, Be'lakor would not be permitted to cross to the mortal world whenever the winds of magic blew strong. Instead, he would leave the realm of chaos only at the Dark God's wish. This was a boon they granted sparingly, and only to crown the mortal as the ever-chosen of chaos, a ceremony which served to assure the celebrant in his god's favour, and torment Be'lakor with his fall from grace. Each time the coronation was concluded, Be'lakor was compelled to visit his rage upon the world as advisor to the ever-chosen, or be banished back to the realms of chaos. Infused with unwanted subservience, Be'lakor led demonic armies at the command of the ever-chosen, only to be banished once more when his unwanted mortal liege was defeated. For his pride and arrogance he would become the Harbinger, he who heralds the conquerors, but never wear the crown. Thousands of years passed between the first two incursions, as the forces of chaos gathered their strength and their influence on the mortal realm, to build an army of mortal followers for another attempt to overthrow the world. In later times, these incursions would become more frequent, with thousands of years becoming 1,000, then 500, then less. The great war against chaos, the incursion led by ever-chosen Azavar Kul, that was halted by his defeat by Magnus the Pious, was a mere 200 years before the ascension of Archaon. After thousands of years existing in madness, Be'lakor woke to find a world greatly changed. Humans had evolved greatly from the primitive beginnings of his own time, but were still far behind the level of advancement of the elves and the dwarves. He found that by exerting his force of will, he could free his consciousness from the realm of chaos, and travel south over the lands as an insubstantial shadow being. Hungrily, the demonic entity took all in that it saw, longing to have physical form to rip and tear at the mortal world it perceived once again. However, the pull of the curse weighed upon him, and he found himself compelled to journey to the northern chaos wastes, detesting himself for being unable to resist. The first of the great conquerors, Morkr the Uniter, was a human of particular vision and force of will, who had come from the nomadic northern tribe of the Talos. He had carved himself a strong following, utilizing the gifts of chaos to elevate himself to the power that he needed to fulfill his grandiose dreams of kingship and glory, and the gods of chaos favored him with their divine attentions. With anger coursing through his being, Be'lakor was compelled by his curse to perform the coronation, placing the crown of domination upon the powerful man's brow as a sign of the god's favor. And so the first great mortal incursion of chaos was launched. With the winds of magic blowing strongly from the poles, demons could manifest on the mortal plane and join the destruction and mayhem alongside Morka and his mortal followers. With his cursed task complete for the first time, Be'lakor sank back screaming in frustration into madness and torment, his humiliation absolute. He did not witness the many glorious victories of the inspiring Morka, nor the rise of Sigmar, the great uniter of the human tribes who would eventually meet him in a titanic single combat. The first mortal incursion was finally broken as Morka fell to a mighty hammer blow of the God King, and the forces bound to his iron will faltered and then fractured. Over the next 1500 years, Be'lakor has been roused from the darkness of insanity. On many occasions as a warlord has risen to be anointed ever-chosen, and he is forced to perform his allotted duty. Each of these conquering champions was a terrifying and unparalleled warrior, and the minions of chaos have flocked to their banner. When the chaotic energies of the poles flow strongly, demonic hosts swell their armies and they flow in an unstoppable tide from the north, cutting a bloody swathe into the lands of the south. But each of these mighty champions has eventually failed to bring about the end times. Each time a saviour has risen to cast down the anointed warlord, and with the ever-chosen defeated, the armies have invariably crumbled into disparate rampaging warbands, soon to be isolated and destroyed, or driven back to the darker places of the world. Yet with each summoning, Be'lakor retained slightly more consciousness of his cursed fate, until the point he was able to start to scheme to avoid his preordained duty. In 1999, a great comet plunged into the blighted city of Mordheim, and threw it and its surrounds into pandemonium. In the madness that followed, Be'lakor was able to manipulate the chaos cultists in the city, and eventually possessed the next warlord due to become the 11th ever chosen, a champion known as Cardun the Gloried. Gaining physical form for the first time in centuries, the Harbinger attempted to take on the mantle of ever chosen in Cardun's stead. Be'lakor used his ancient powers to warp and twist the flesh of his host, to become an immense monstrosity known as the Shadow Lord. Be'lakor revelled in his triumph, believing he'd finally broken free of the curse, to take his rightful place at the head of the invasion to come. The dark gods watched on in amusement, awaiting Be'lakor to discover the flaw in his plan. Despite the chaotic energies permeating the city of the damned feeding him power, in his new physical form he could not draw in enough to navigate the shadow paths to the resting place of the crown of domination, paths he could travel without effort in his incorporeal form. His frustration and rage combined with the chaotic energies coursing through his body tore the physical form of his host apart, and despite denying the rise of one ever chosen, Be'lakor was still cast back to the void and the downward spiral of insanity. Only 3 centuries were to pass before Azavar Kul the Anointed arose amongst the tribes of the Kurgan, and Be'lakor was summoned again to perform his hated task. Azavar Kul led the greatest incursion seen since Morka, and it surged southwards, rampaging through northern Kislev, and sieging and capturing the mighty city of Prague, and sacking Erengrad, before the long-divided empire could form any sort of coordinated response to aid their northern allies. Slaying thousands on his rampage through Kislev and leaving the taint of corruption in their wake, the Empire prayed for deliverance, and it was Magnus the Pious who would rise to unite the Empire once more, and met the armies of Azavar Kul in titanic battle at the gates of the capital city of Kislev itself. When Kul was cast down in that final confrontation with Magnus and his allies, Be'lakor watched on in impotent rage as once again an anointed and favoured conqueror was vanquished, and the ascendancy of chaos denied. Resisting the pull of madness more than ever before, he formed the certain belief that he should lead the forces of chaos to ultimate victory in the mortal plane, as was his destiny before his powers were so cruelly diminished by his masters. In one of his periods of lucidity, Be'lakor had seen the key to avoiding his fate in the mist-shrouded Isle of Albion, and the power of its ancient Ogham stones. Holding some grip on the mortal realm alongside his lucidity, Be'lakor began to enact his guileful plan, and found ways to stretch forth his will upon the mortal world. As the power of the next ever-chosen Archaon began to grow, Be'lakor's influence was starting to spread through the Citadel of Lead, where his essence was materializing. Be'lakor's ultimate goal was to subvert the power of the Ogham Stones and use them to take physical form before being called to crown Archaon. He intended then to descend on the mortal champion who could have even been his own half-breed offspring, and feed on his soul in the sight of the 4 dark gods. It is interesting that Be'lakor saw his path to lead Chaos to victory on the mist-shrouded Isle, seeing as in the Great Catastrophe where he himself was elevated to immortality. One of the fatal flaws that led to the defeat of Chaos was concentrating their attack on Ulthuan and leaving the Isle of Albion untouched. The ancient Truthsayers had gathered the giants and bade them to construct a series of stone circles, then tasked them with guarding these circles that they had erected. Created specifically by the Old Ones to guard Albion before the collapse of the Polar Gates, these giants were highly intelligent and knew the importance of their vigilance. In many ways, the Truthsayers' mastery of this form of magic rivaled the elves. Not only were they able to contain their chaotic energies, but they were able to use the stones to weave their own veil of fog around the island, protecting the Ogham Stones from danger. Much like how the sacrifices of the Slann secretly aided the ritual to create the Great Vortex, the elves would certainly have been overrun by the demonic hordes long before the rise of Anarion, had the Druids of Albion not succeeded in stemming the flows of energy. Preferring the safety of their remote isle to the danger of the outside world, the humans of Albion became introverted and reclusive. The giants also suffered as centuries of inbreeding dulled their minds, and through boredom they would often resort to mindless displays of strength. Despite the degeneration of the human tribes into warring savages, the Truthsayers still passed on the ceremonies and rituals to maintain the Shroud of Mist and the magical power of the Ogham Stones, but over time many of the more ancient laws were lost, and their art became a shadow of what it was. It was amongst the ranks of these Truthsayers that Be'lakor probed for weakness, corruption, and ambition. The Citadel of Lead was once a sacred temple of the Truthsayers, a mighty bastion towering high into the sky. Built on the instructions of the Old Ones from the magical dampening metal, none now living knew why it was constructed or who built it, but the natives say it had always been there. For many millennia it remained closed to all, as none could ever find the entrance to the fortress. Some said it was the dwelling place of a long-vanished race, and even the giants were reluctant to venture near its ominous walls. Shortly before the mists started to clear, a Truthsayer known as Keklis, one of the most respected amongst his kind, announced that he had deciphered an ancient text on how to open a portal to the Citadel. He called a council of Truthsayers and announced that he would go to the Citadel and attempt to enter the fortress. For many months no one heard from him, and a number of Truthsayers all set out on quests to discover what had happened to their brother. None ever returned, and on one dark night lights were seen emanating from the fortress, an unnatural light that pulsed from the few windows, and it was shortly after this that the mists began to clear. The Truthsayers who entered the Citadel emerged, but they were changed. Their once powerful muscular build had become hunched and crooked. They hid themselves beneath layers of robes, and each wore a cowl hiding their faces. They called a council and bade all the Truthsayers join them in the worship of a new master. They talked of the powers they would be able to unleash if they would draw from the energies contained in the Ogham Stones. But the Dark Master had underestimated the Truthsayer Council, and as guardians of Albions and protectors of the stones for generations, the outraged council cast the Dark Emissaries from Albion, who swore vengeance. Over the next decade, the Dark Emissaries spread out, traversing the world and speaking of the returning Dark Master, who had come to conquer all. They offered their services and whispered rewards of untold wealth and power for those who would align with their dread lord. Soon many of the malicious races of the old world were descending on Albion, each willing to wrestle for control of the Ogham Stones the Dark Master so desired, alongside their own thirsts for pillage and bloodshed. The Truthsayers who had opposed the Dark Enemies called out to the great civilizations of order, and foretold of the great peril to the old world should Albion and its long secret magical protections fall. Expedition forces from the races of men, elves and dwarves soon set sail for Albion, again with their own agendas, but still convinced of the importance of defying the forces of chaos gaining the power of the Sacred Stone circles. After a full year of conflict in 2518, the war for Albion reached its final conclusion. On the storm-lashed plain of battles, the native Gaels and their High Elf allies brought the final allied force of the Dark Master, mainly comprised of Dark Elf Reavers and the Dark Emissaries of the Citadel, to a bloody final confrontation. Steel rang against steel in a desperate struggle fought in sticky mud that favoured visceral instinct above finesse. The Dark Elves were finally routed, and with that hard-fought victory behind them, the forces of Order pushed on to the Citadel of Lead itself. Aiming to avoid a protracted siege, a small force of shadow warriors and hunters was able to infiltrate the walls and take control of a secondary gate, long enough for their forces to enter the Citadel's fortifications. The battle was fierce, with Elf and Gael falling upon the minions of Be'lakor and his plotting Skaven allies they found within. Having caught the defenders off guard with their daring assault, the Council of Truthsayers led by Durak marched deep into the Citadel to break the flow of magic cascading over Albion in the Dark Master's attempt to gain full physical form. The assembled Truthsayers focused their minds as they attempted to wrestle the chaotic winds back into some form of balanced flow through the geomantic Ogham network, with Durak leading their ancient ritual as passed down from the Old Ones to their long-distant predecessors. The ebb and flow of the energies was calmed, but the Ogham network was maybe damaged beyond repair by the actions of the Dark Emissaries. With his forces defeated and the inner sanctums of the Citadel besieged, Be'lakor was forced to flee. He had succeeded in partially materializing in the mortal plane, having siphoned off enough sustaining magic to now exist as a creature of semi-corporeal shadow. Now suitably armed with his Blade of Shadows, a demonic blade whose essence could be changed at the whim of Be'lakor from a formless shadow to a murderous edge, the Dark Master escaped from Albion. Be'lakor was most likely once again an unknowing pawn of the Chaos Gods all along, as while his scheme to gain physical form that could challenge Archaon, it was through his actions that destabilized the geomantic web supporting the Great Vortex in Ulthuan, widening the rifts at the poles of the world and allowing the Chaos Wastes to spread further south, and supporting the incursion of the Ever-Chosen. Before Be'lakor could set into motion any further schemes, he was called to fulfill his hated destiny. Appearing in the sky above Archaon, borne on dark wings, the hordes of chaos fell in reverence before the Harbinger. Filled with hatred, Be'lakor struck a darkly angelic figure, but despite the defiance in his bearing, he was compelled by his curse to bend the knee to Archaon and lead him to the crown of domination required to complete his anointment as the Ever-Chosen. With his own intricate plans thwarted and his hated fate once again complete, Be'lakor was able to retreat back to the Dark Realm and seethe that he once again would be in the shadows as another led the forces of chaos to conquer the mortal realm. In implementing Be'lakor into the Total War timeline, Creative Assembly could go one of two ways. They could have him as the Dark Master, a regular legendary lord based maybe in Albion prior to crowning Archaon. You would wonder how he works in a new game being associated with Chaos Undivided though. But what I would like him to be is a 10th Lord, unlockable as part of one of the main storyline campaigns. Imagine taking one of the mortal champions of Chaos to the point of being crowned Ever-Chosen, and the unlock being to lead Be'lakor, much like we had with Satharel the Everwatcher. Or even more inventive, having the choice of whether to try and wield some great power against the forces of Chaos as part of the Kislev or Cathay storyline. Be'lakor might not get his own campaign to play this way, but he would be an amazing incentive to unlock along with an overhaul of the Warriors of Chaos. Thank you for listening and the amazing support the channel has had recently. I'm blown away. I hope you've enjoyed the story of Be'lakor, the First Daemon Prince, and I've earned your sub today. And I'll see you again in the near future, where there is only war.